VoiceAmerica.com.
You're listening to The Kathryn Zox Show. If you would like to join our conversation this morning, call now. The toll-free number is 866-472-5788. That number again is 866-472-5788.
Kathryn Zox, your social worker with a microphone, and you're listening to The Kathryn Zox Show on VoiceAmericaVariety.com and World Talk Radio. Joining me this morning is my second guest, Vikas Jhingran, and he is the author of Emote, Using Emotions to Make Your Message Memorable. Vikas is a MIT-trained engineer and researcher who used to suffer from poor speaking skills, due in large part to being both an introvert and an immigrant. And so he started public speaking to improve in this area and eventually won the Toastmasters 2007 World Championship of Public Speaking, the first East Indian and only the second Asian to do so in the 80-year history of the competition. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you on this morning, Vikas.
Kathryn, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so your book, Emote, Using Emotions to Make Your Message Memorable. Well, I guess it's really important for all of us to make our message memorable, whether it's, and particularly in business, but anywhere, even just in terms of connecting and relationships. So you, in your book, describe an emotion-based approach to verbal communications. Let's talk about what that is and why it's important.
Yeah, sure, Kathryn. I like to always give people an example to understand what this concept is about. We all have a favorite dish that we usually eat whenever we go to a restaurant. For me, that's a coconut-based Thai curry. So I have this chicken and coconut curry over rice, and that's really something that I enjoy. But I always look back and think about the two questions. First, what fills my stomach? And it's pretty clear that the rice and then the chicken really fill my stomach. But that's not why I remember the dish and go back and eat it again and again. The reason I go back is because of the sauces and the spices. And this analogy actually goes over to speaking and communications very well, because even though people come and talk to you and listen to you because of the information you provide, they will never remember the information if that is the only thing you provide. The reason they remember the information is because the sauces and the spices, which in a speaking context are the emotions that go with it. So the emotions really make your information memorable. And that's really what the book is about.
So we're talking about the transfer of emotions when you are transferring information or communicating.
That's right. And sometimes we forget about the stories and the emotional side of the information that we are providing. Any information we provide has a story behind it. How was it collected? What is the background? All of that we tend to forget and just share, this is it, this is the final result, without realizing that is not how people will remember it. They will remember it if you provide the stories and the emotions behind it. That is what will make your final information memorable. And so we tend to provide so much of information without realizing that almost none of it will be remembered by the audience unless we provide the emotional aspect to it.
Give us an example of that, of someone who is able to do that, and perhaps maybe the opposite of when there is a lot of information, but we never get too much of it because of the way it's presented. That's what you're talking about. So, give us a context in which we can, of a speech or, some kind of a communication process that would be helpful for us to really understand what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So let me give you a couple of examples and then maybe describe a process of how this could be done. So I'm a researcher by training. I still work in a very technical area. And I go to a lot of conferences which are technical in nature, where people have done wonderful research and experiments and then have this conference, they get up and talk about that. And it's very common to have people come up and just present slide after slide of data and information. Essentially, what they have been able to do in a couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years, is is put in a 20-minute presentation without providing any kind of context, the challenges they went through, the experiments that did not work, the issues that they had, the wrong paths that they took. Those are the things really that get an audience emotionally involved, and they will begin to relate with the process and the data, and thereby remember the information that you tend to provide. So I see a very few people actually do that. And I'll give you an example of how I try to incorporate that in a speech that I made a couple of years ago, also in a very technical conference. It was about some data that we in our company, a bunch of researchers, had collected, and it was very unusual. And only when we were able to go back and understand what the data was about, were we able to understand how it relates to what the technical findings were. So essentially, it made sense, but we had to spend a lot of time understanding why it made sense or how it made sense and provided great insight. So I thought, well, this is very much like a criminal case, So I thought about Sherlock Holmes and said, this is how Sherlock Holmes does his work. He walks into a crime scene, nothing makes sense, and then over a process of the case, pieces things together, and eventually, when the case is resolved, everything makes sense. It makes perfect sense. I said, this is exactly our story. So my whole presentation was in the form of a Sherlock Holmes case. And I came in, and the first slide was the crime scene. And the crime scene was where the data was collected, and it was about these, criminals, a bunch of researchers who went about doing, finding out some information, and eventually it was resolved, and when it was resolved, everything made sense. So by putting it in terms of a story, that whole piece of information was made a lot more memorable because people could relate to it, they enjoy stories, it provides a very strong emotional context, and thereby, even though the same information was presented, it was presented in a way now that people will remember for a long time.
Vikas, I'm thinking you're an engineer, MIT-trained engineer, and when we think of engineers, it's always boring data. I mean, that's what I think of. If I had to sit through a presentation of engineering, as you're describing it, some kind of a research, it would be, my expectation would be that it would be boring, but as you put it in that Sherlock Holmes contest, that's very clever. I like that. What other examples do you have? I mean, of how this works? Because in social work, we talk about putting a face on the problem. If we're talking about diagnoses and treatment of a patient or individuals, we talk about case histories because that's how people remember it. That's how they can relate to it, relate to the diagnoses. So it's another way of saying it, but putting a face on the problem.
You're absolutely right. Actually, the business community has already figured this out a long time ago. They have a system of education which is based on case studies. And case studies is, as you mentioned, nothing more than information presented with a story. So you have these people who are given characters, and there's a background story behind it, and you discuss the issue where people get involved, they get emotionally involved, and because of these emotions, this information is now made memorable. So this approach actually is used all over, maybe not called this way, but essentially the essence of the approach is seen in many, many aspects of what we do. What's happened on the engineering side, on the research side, is that, we get trained a lot on writing and reading skills, and this is just a problem with our education system, and very little on speaking and listening skills. And when you come into the workforce and you're working in teams, listening and speaking skills are the most important communication forms. And what's happened is we've gone through years of this training, but we've not been trained in the two common forms of communication that are used in corporate America. So we really come out unprepared, and that's really how I felt when 10 years ago when I started this journey. I was basically second to none in anything related to math, science, and engineering, but could not communicate very well. And
well, you describe yourself as an introvert and an immigrant, and those were two things that were holding you back in terms of your communication skills. So how do you take somebody who is an introvert, because introverts, it would seem to me, it's very difficult to speak no matter what kind of a story you're telling, and if you're an immigrant and you have trouble with the language, that's an added piece to it. So how did this all work for you? How were you able to even get up in front of an audience and speak?
And so that's really what I've learned in my journey. And what I began to understand is verbal communication, to a great extent, is just a back and forth of emotion. And this back and forth of emotion forms the soul of what a speech is about, or what communications is about. And once I understood that, then I began to realize that all the things that I thought were perceived handicaps, like my grammar, maybe I used to think in a different language, my native language, so I was a little slow in getting the right words. But I began to realize that these are all tools which help with that emotional exchange. This is not what a speech is about. So that really helped me get over these perceived handicaps. And I began to realize that if I'm authentic, I bring myself to the table, I can engage people emotionally, because emotions are much more than these tools that we use in speaking and communication. And that understanding and realization really propelled my growth as a communicator.
So what groups specifically do you address? I know you've written the book, but besides that, you work directly with people, helping them to understand how to do presentations, to do speeches. What groups do you work with, or are you working with now?
So actually, to tell you the truth, my present occupation is still as an engineer. I work for Shell Oil Company based out of Houston. And that's what I do for a living. This is a passion of mine, which I've realized really contributes to my being an effective leader and an engineer and researcher in corporate America. So what I've tried to do here is to present an understanding, a different way to look at verbal communication, which I think will get a lot of people out of what they think are perceived handicaps, and help them understand that they too can be wonderful communicators if they just understand fundamentally what they're trying to do when they're communicating.
So what would you do in a workshop? Because I know you do conduct these workshops to help people become better speakers. Give me an example of a typical workshop that you would do, and for whom.
Sure. So, one of the main things I try to achieve in a workshop is to help people understand fundamentally what they're doing when they are communicating or when they get up and speak. So what I'll try to do is, the first thing I ask people is what is a speech? Help me define what a speech is. And you would be surprised, people who've been communicating for years, have delivered literally hundreds of presentations have a hard time defining a speech or what they are doing when they get up and speak. And that process is very clarifying for a lot of people. Then what I try to do is to help them understand in a very different way as to what a speech is about. So what I'll do is I'll play a piece of music, and I will just ask them to be aware of their emotions as this piece of music plays. And I choose the piece of music so that after 3 or 4 minutes, their emotional state is completely changed. So they were maybe emotionally neutral at the start of the piece of music, and after 4 minutes, because of a music composer who really knows how to work with emotions, they would feel excited or sad or really thrilled and victorious. So a lot of energy would come just after 4 minutes. And I tell them, this is exactly what a speech is. It's just that you are using different tools. You're using verbal, words, grammar, you're using vocal varieties, gestures, stories, but essentially what you're doing at a fundamental level is working with the emotions of your audience. And if you understand where you want your audience to end up emotionally, this is the emotional state that I want my audience to be at the end of a speech, then you can craft a speech, an emotional journey that will make your message memorable.
And all right, I want to give you an example, because today, particularly in this economy, people are fundraising is a big thing because it's very difficult to raise funds these days for different organizations, nonprofit organizations. And how would you, let's say you were getting up and giving a speech and you just said you need to know where you want to go with this speech, what you want from your audience after you give the speech. Let's say you want money from them. You want them to donate to a particular cause, your cause. What would you do in that kind of a situation? What kind of emotion are you trying to get from the audience so that they will act on your speech?
Sure. So that's actually a very good point. So here's the situation. Really, the purpose of your speech is for people to contribute to your cause, whatever the cause might be. So basically trying to raise some funds. So the question really at the start of the speech is the first question you should be asking yourself: what do I want my audience to feel at the end of the speech so that my purpose is fulfilled? That means they are likely to give or donate to the cause. And in that case, you sit back and say, how should I feel? Why would I donate to a cause? And so the first thing might be that you want your audience to feel that they're making a difference, that their contribution is going to materially change somebody's life. The second thing you might want them to feel is that this organization will use your funds in the right way. That means they'll not be wasted. There's not a lot of money going into managing things and not being put into use. That is solved. So we are going to take care of your money, and you will make a difference by doing this. The third thing you might want to point out is that you're leaving a legacy. You're leaving behind, you're now part of a cause that is much larger than who you are. And these are strong emotions that you can leave your audience with, which will make it likely for them to then contribute to your cause. And then the whole process of writing the speech, however long you have for the speech, is essentially helping them get to this emotional state and planning that emotional journey. And if the end of the speech, if you have made them feel this way, then in my opinion, you have delivered a wonderful speech.
Do you ever want your audience to feel guilty so that after they will do something because they feel guilty? You've created this sense of guilt for whatever it is that you want for them?
Oh, absolutely. So here's the real interesting part about working with emotions. The good emotions that we deal with, love, joy, are very soft emotions. The stronger emotions are actually the negative emotions: anger, hatred, fear. These are very strong emotions. So a very common technique used by speakers, and actually commonly used by politicians, is that they use the strong emotions to help people do or act in ways in which they would want them to act. So you could use very strong emotions, say for some, just to give you an example, say I want people to stop smoking. And so I go up and do a pitch. Now I can talk about wonderful health benefits and this and that. But what I could also do is use very strong negative emotions like fear of death, like losing something. Negative emotions, fear of guilt. Guilt, and then turn it around and say, I don't want you to feel this way, and that is why I want you to stop smoking. And that could be very powerful because the negative emotions are much stronger than the positive emotions.
So, in other words, you want people to stop smoking. You make them feel guilty that smoking may cause their child to become ill or sick or even die because of secondhand.
That's exactly right.
Smoking.
That's exactly right.
Well, you mentioned politicians. Okay, let's talk about how do politicians get us to vote for them?
I would be surprised if you don't find politicians talking about using fear and anger as a common strategy before elections to get out the vote and get people on their side. So instead of talking about what they bring to the table, they talk about the fear and the anger on their opponent. And basically, you need to elect me because this is what's going to happen to you if you elect this other guy. And those emotions are much stronger. So what they do is they understand that these strong emotions will propel people to act and come out and vote. And essentially what they're doing is vote for me because this is what's going to happen if you vote for your opponent. And that's how they get out the vote. Understanding that the stronger emotions are the negative emotions and thereby using them is unfortunate, but that's why they do it.
Here's another, this is more of an individual example. Like, it's not exactly a speech that you're giving to a lot of people, but let's say you're trying to convince a panel that you should be hired for a job, whatever the job is. You're going into a company, you're being interviewed by 3 or 4 people, it may be individually, but maybe all at the same time. So then you're sitting there and you are, in a sense, giving a speech about yourself.
Yep.
So what do we do? How do we get hired for that job?
So this is another very similar situation where you're being interviewed for a job, and the real question you need to ask is, how do I need these people to feel for them to give me an opportunity? Is essentially the question. And you could come up with a couple of emotional states that you want to leave these people with. One is competence, and second is that if you don't hire me, then somebody else will. So I bring a lot to the table. If you don't hire me, then somebody else will. So that's an emotional state that you can leave them with, which brings a lot of urgency to make for them to make a decision. Okay? So these are a couple of emotional states that you can leave them with. And how you do that is the process of preparing for the interview. You know, what do you do to help them understand that, or make them feel that you're competent? What do you do in the interview to help them understand that you bring a lot to the table and that your skills are valuable in the market, and if they don't make a decision, then somebody else will probably offer you a job pretty soon. So that's the process of preparing for an interview. But eventually, you want them to leave with these two kind of emotions so that they can make a decision quickly. They're prepared to act.
Well, I'm kind of honing in now and getting even more personal, because I know in your bio you say you live with your wife and your 2 sons in Houston, Texas. Okay, 2 sons, you have children. I don't know how old they are, but you know, particularly as your children get older and teenagers, and I'm a social worker, and so I'm interested in how you would use your techniques to convince your children, let's say your teenagers, to do things that you think are good for them that they absolutely don't want to do. And essentially you are giving speeches. You know, if you have 2 kids, I raised
absolutely.
3. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about this approach is it actually not only helps you develop a speech, it helps you develop a communication strategy. So how do I approach this problem? What is my communication strategy to tackle this problem? And so this is a similar problem. So I have very small kids, 4 and 2, but what I love about them is kids at that age basically are completely working on emotions. So they do things when they feel comfortable. They cry when they're uncomfortable. They let you know exactly what their the feedback is instantaneous. And that's beautiful, because it helps me understand how I have to make my 2-year-old or my 4-year-old feel for them to do something. It could be as simple as just have dinner, which is, you know, sometimes takes an hour-long exercise every evening. But even there, just understanding how do I make my 4-year-old feel so that he's going to have dinner, and that's really a communication exercise in itself. So everyday experiences can be used to help you get better using this approach, because really you are communicating for 80% of the time you're awake, you're communicating in some way. And so this approach applies to all of those communication situations.
Well, I want to mention the book again, because we only have a couple minutes left. So it's Vikas Jhingran, and his book is Emote, Using Emotions to Make Your Message Memorable. And we can go online, I assume, and we obviously can buy the book, Amazon.com, bookstores everywhere. But do you have a website, Vikas, that we can go to?
Absolutely. My website is vikassjhingran.com, and that's spelled VIKASJHINGRAN.com.
So that will give us information about the book, and also because you do conduct these seminars and workshops. Do you go around the country doing that, and is there a schedule for that if anyone were interested?
Yes, so you can find all of that information on my website. I do take on workshop opportunities and keynote opportunities all over the country. My schedule is limited because I don't do this full time, but you can find my schedule online and you can get in touch with me to check out an opportunity.
Well, it's been great talking to you today. I'm going to take everything that I learned from you because in each one of those situations that you described, I'm about to give a speech, and I've got children, and I mean, it's very practical, I guess, and very easy to do once you understand it, even for those who are introverts or who are not, who come here from other countries and don't speak the language. So, very helpful.
Thank you, Kathryn. I hope it is empowering to some of those people who are afraid of getting up and speaking.
Definitely, very empowering. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye. You've been listening to The Kathryn Zox Show, and I'm your social worker with a microphone. You've been listening to The Kathryn Zox Show on VoiceAmericaVariety.com and World Talk Radio. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
We hope you have enjoyed today's episode of The Kathryn Zox Show. You can listen live every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America channel. Want to know more about Kathryn? Visit her website at www.kathrynzox.com. Be sure to join us next week for more interviews and great conversations with Kathryn Zox.
Thanks again for listening to the preceding program, brought to you on the Voice America Variety Channel. For more information about our network and to check out additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit VoiceAmericaVariety.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit VoiceAmerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the preceding program are strictly those of the hosts or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by Voice America Talk Radio Network,